The mere fact that women are singled out particularly, I think, says something about our society, about our culture, which to a large extent is misogynist. We get it even in the New Testament, in the writings of St. Paul, that it is woman who introduces sin, it is woman who is the temptress. In a sense, it's woman who is the cause of the fall. So there's a very, very strong element of this, both in the New Testament and certainly right throughout the Christian period.
Guilt and sin were now part of every Christian's life. Sexuality was no longer a gift, but the root of all evil, and woman was the obstacle to man's holiness. From every pulpit, celibate priests declared that the end of the world was at hand. The pious would go to heaven, the wicked would burn in hell. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that next to contemplating God, the greatest pleasure for the blessed ones in heaven would be watching the tortures of the eternally damned. In the 14th century, the end of the world arrived in the form of the Black Plague. It was followed by a series of epidemics that swept across Europe for the next 200 years. The priests said it was God's punishment for sin, but their sacraments did not ease the suffering. People turned to the village wise woman in search of help and comfort.
Peculiar things happened at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century. Namely, it would seem that the female population increased more rapidly than the male population. Why this was so, it's difficult to ascertain. Possibly extensive war saw the decimation of male numbers. Some have argued that women were more immune to diseases that were rampant at the time, including the plague, so that you would develop this kind of disproportion within the population. Now, the importance of that in a patriarchal society is that women begin to outlive men, and not only that, women, because of their excessive numbers, do not find husbands. They don't marry and become, willy-nilly, independent. And in a patriarchal society, this is a very, very difficult thing to come to grips with.
By the 16th century, women's rights to inherit and own property had been eroded. Many women became dependent on charity for survival. Those who held on to their property were objects of suspicion and envy. At a time when life expectancy was 40 years, just being old was suspect. Widows, spinsters, and those who begged for a living were the most vulnerable to charges of witchcraft. They were easy scapegoats for communities plagued by war and disease.
These were centuries of incredible strife, uncertainty, clash between Protestant and Catholic, and most important, a kind of groundswell of anti-clerical feeling. It strikes me that the witch craze is a kind of an answer for institutions which feel threatened. In other words, if one could convince the lower classes that their difficulties arose from the fact that witches were present and were blighting the harvests, were causing barrenness in the marriage bed, what have you, it would sort of take the pressure off the establishment. It's not the state, it's not the Pope, it's not the bishop who is the cause of your anguish. It's the cursed presence of the witches.
She flew through the night air on missions of destruction. And everything she touched turned to death and disease. She was the hag, the devil's agent, the poisoner, the one with the evil eye.
This false image of a witch as an old hag. First of all, the witches were not all old. The women who were burned were not all old. There were some old women. There were a lot of children. It certainly affected how we look at women today, and it's used as a great put-down that women are hags. Hag used to mean sacred knowledge, a woman who had sacred knowledge. Old women used to be revered because they did have this ancient knowledge and sacred knowledge and passed it on to others, so that it was wonderful to be an old woman.
There is evidence that women did meet in groups to participate in the old rituals and to exchange news. But as the witch persecutions reached their height, meetings like these became more and more dangerous. Women who gathered at night were thought to be evil, an idea reinforced by the art and literature of the time.
In the cauldron, boil and bake. I'll add newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blind wormy thing, lizard's leg and hound's wing.
It was an age of superstition, and so no one doubted the existence of witches. It was difficult not to believe when thousands were being burned. Historians call it the Renaissance and Reformation, a time of rebirth in art and learning. An age of church reform. It was also the dawn of the scientific revolution. The telescope was invented, and a new world was discovered.
The scientific revolution relied explicitly and heavily on the techniques of the Inquisition, the techniques of questioning witches in the witch burnings. Francis Bacon, who's one of the fathers of the scientific method and one of the leading exponents of the scientific revolution, talked about how important it was to use the techniques of the Inquisition to tease or torture the secrets out of Mother Earth or Mother Nature.
It was an age that marked the rise of the bureaucratic state and the emergence of capitalism. In cities all over Europe, a new profit ethic was beginning to take hold.